The horse went down before I even heard the ice crack. 1 second I was riding hard through the pass, leaning into the wind, and the next, nothing under me, just cold. Just the sound of a river I couldn't see, then a woman screaming somewhere in the white. I pulled myself out of the snow by feel alone, couldn't see my own hands. The blizzard had come in fast, the way they do in the Black Hills in November. No warning, no courtesy. Just a wall of white fury that drops the temperature 20 degrees in 10 minutes and turns a man's lungs into 2 burning bags of ice. My horse was already struggling to stand. I left her. I followed the sound of that scream. I almost stepped on her. She was half buried in a drift against a deadfall pine. One arm stretched out like she'd been reaching for something she never caught. Her coat, a city woman's coat, wool pretty, completely useless, was soaked through. She wasn't screaming anymore. That scared me more than the scream had. I dropped to my knees and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. Alive, barely. The pulse was there, but it was slow and distant, like a drum being played in another room. My name is Chayton. My father's people are Oglala Lakota. My mother was a white schoolteacher from Iowa, who fell in love with a man she had no business falling in love with, which I always thought was a very fine thing to do. I grew up on the edge of 2 worlds and never fully belonged to either, which, when you're young, feels like a wound. When you get older, you understand it's a door. I was 34 years old that November. I'd been riding the reservation's upper boundary to check on 3 families who hadn't been heard from since the early snow. The wind had been building all morning. I should have turned back at noon. I didn't. That stubbers. I got it from both sides of my family, equal measure. I got her out of the drift. She was small. Light enough that I was worried a person could be that light and still be alive in cold like this. I pulled her against my chest, and she made a sound, not quite a word, something lower than a word, something the biox when it's surprised to feel warmth and doesn't know what to do with it. "I've got you," I said. I don't know why I said it in English. Maybe because she looked like someone who needed English. Maybe because I needed to hear it myself. The shelter, I knew these hills. I'd known them since I was 7 years old, and my grandfather first brought me up here and told me the names of the rocks, the same way other grandfathers tell their grandchildren the names of cousins. There was a granite overhang half a mile east, sheltered from the north wind, a place my grandfather called the ear of the mountain because of the way it curved. I'd sheltered there before in bad weather. I could find it blind. I carried her. My horse followed. The wind was screaming by then. A full whiteout, the kind where the snow comes at you sideways and you stop being sure which direction is up. I kept my left shoulder into the wind and counted my steps, and didn't think about anything except the next step, and the weight of her against my chest, and the small cloud of breath she was still making against my collar. She was still making breath. That was everything. That was the whole world. The overhang was there, exactly where I knew it would be. I got her inside, out of the wind, and the silence was so sudden it felt like a different kind of noise. I laid her on the ground and got to work. I had what I always carried in my saddlebag in winter, a wool blanket, a small hatchet, dried meat, matches in a waterproof tin, and 2 buffalo robes I'd gotten from my uncle the previous spring. People in the city would look at those robes and see something old-fashioned, something from a museum. I looked at them and saw survival. My grandfather had told me, the buffalo kept us warm for 10,000 years. Don't be too proud to let them keep doing it. I stripped the wet coat off her. She stirred and tried to push my hands away, half conscious, which I took as a good sign. I peeled away the soaked inner layers, keeping what was dry, adding my own heavy flannel shirt over everything, and then I wrapped her in both robes. The first one flat underneath her, the second one over and tucked under. Then I wedged her between me and the granite wall, got a small fire going with the dead wood I dragged in from the edges of the storm, and I just held on. She shivered for a long time. Real shivering is good. It means the body hasn't quit. She shivered for a long time. Real shivering is good. Most people don't know that. When a person stops shivering is when you start to panic, because it means the body has given up trying to warm itself. She shivered so hard her teeth rattled and her whole body shook against mine. And I held her tighter and talked. Low, steady, the way you talk to a frightened horse. I told her the names of the hills. I told her about the families I'd been riding to check on, about old Henry Swiftwind, who was 72 years old and still chopped his own firewood, about his granddaughter who was learning to bead and had made me a hatband I was too sentimental to ever actually wear. I talked because silence was dangerous, and because I needed to stay awake myself. Somewhere in the dark middle of that night, she stopped shivering. My heart dropped. And then she exhaled, long and slow, and her body went soft in a different way. Not the terrible limpness of the cold. The real loosening of a person, finally, warm enough to sleep. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since noon. "What?" she said. When she woke just before dawn. I knew the moment she became conscious because every muscle in her body tensed at once. The animal awareness of a person realizing they don't know where they are. I kept still. I kept my arms around her the same way they'd been, I said quietly. "The storm's still going, you're safe. I'm chasing. I found you in the snow." A long pause. I could feel her thinking. "How long?" she said. Her voice was wrecked. Raw from the cold, rough at the edges, but real. Solid. I liked it immediately. "About 8 hours," I said. Another pause. "You've been holding me for 8 hours?" "You needed the warmth." She didn't say anything to that for a moment. Then, "Thank you." Just those 2 words, but the way she said them, careful, like she was handing me something fragile, made them feel like much more. "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Storm hasn't quit." She almost laughed. "Not quite." A small sound that was trying to be a laugh and got most of the way there. "Practical man," she said. "Out here you have to be." She was quiet for a little while and I fed the fire, and she watched the flames, and somewhere in that watching she started talking. Her name was Eleanor. Eleanor Marsh. She was 43 years old, which she told me with the particular directness of a woman who has decided she is done apologizing for her age. She was a widow. Her husband had died 2 years ago, a slow death. The kind that takes a man in stages and leaves the woman who loved him standing at the end of it, not knowing who she is without the weight of caring for someone. She'd come out here, out west, out to the hills, because she'd read about them in a book and needed to be somewhere that felt as large on the outside as she felt empty on the inside. She'd hired a guide who'd left her when the weather turned, deciding his own skin was worth more than her money. She'd tried to make it back to town on her own. "That was a very dangerous decision," I said. "I know that now," she said, a pause. "I knew it then too, I just didn't care very much." I turned to look at her then. She was looking at the fire. Her face in the firelight. She was striking in the way that real faces are striking. The kind of face that has had weather in it, has had grief in it, has had years in it, and is therefore far more interesting than a face that hasn't. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was half loose, and there was a cut on her chin she'd gotten from the fall I still didn't know the details of, and she was wearing my flannel shirt over her remaining layers and wrapped in 2 buffalo robes. And she was the most alive-looking person I could remember seeing in a long time. "You care now?" I asked. She looked at me. Her eyes were gray-green. Storm-colored, I thought. And then I thought that was a stupid thought, and then I thought it anyway because it was true. "Yes," she said. "I think I do." And then, softer, "I didn't expect that." Mullen, the second day, the storm kept us another full day. I don't know how to explain what it is to be kept in a small space with a person by weather. It's different from choosing to be somewhere together. There's a stripping away that happens. All the polite distance you keep between yourself and a stranger dissolves, because there's simply nowhere to put it. You see a person eat and sleep and worry and laugh, and you see all the small, unguarded moments that people spend their whole lives hiding from each other. Eleanor was funny. I hadn't expected that. She had a dry, quiet humor that she deployed without warning, and the first time she made me laugh, genuinely laugh, the kind that comes from the chest, she looked surprised, and then pleased in a way she tried to hide and didn't quite manage. She asked me about the Lakota. Not the way people usually ask, not as though they're consulting a museum exhibit, but with real curiosity, the kind that comes from a person who reads seriously and thinks seriously and knows how much they don't know. I told her about my grandfather, about the way he understood the land, the way the land was not a backdrop for his life, but the actual substance of it. I told her about the ceremonies I'd been taught and the ones I'd been allowed to witness, and the long, careful education of learning to be in a place, rather than just on it. She listened the way good listeners listen, not waiting for her turn to talk, but actually following, asking questions that showed she'd heard the last thing I'd said and was thinking about it. I asked her about her husband. She talked about him for a long time. I let her. He'd been a good man, she said, a genuinely good man, which she'd understood was rare, and felt lucky to have had even if she'd lost him. She talked about grief the way someone talks about a landscape they've walked through, with real knowledge of the terrain. She knew exactly what it felt like. She was not pretending it was over. "Do you think it ever really ends?" she asked, not looking for comfort, looking for truth. "I don't think it ends," I said. "I think it becomes something you carry differently, less in your hands, more in your back." You stop noticing it's there until you sit down. She was quiet for a long moment. That's the most honest thing anyone's said to me in 2 years, she said. Outside, the wind was doing what wind does, trying every direction until it found the one that hurt. Outside, the wind was doing what wind does, trying every direction until it found the one that hurt. Inside, we ate dried meat and melted snow for water, and I showed her how to bank a fire to last through a cold night, and she watched and asked questions and remembered everything I showed her. A capable woman. You could see it in the way she held information, not passively, but like she was already figuring out where it fit. That second night, she fell asleep first. I sat awake and kept the fire and listened to the storm wind down and thought about things I hadn't thought about in a long time. I had been alone for 4 years. Not unhappily, I am not a man who fills silence to avoid it, but alone. And I hadn't realized, until I was sitting beside a sleeping woman in a granite shelter in a dying blizzard, how thoroughly I'd made my peace with that aloneness. How completely I'd arranged my life around it. How it had become not just a condition but a kind of identity I'd stopped questioning. I looked at her sleeping face. I thought, here is a woman who knows what it costs to love someone and lost them anyway, and who walked into a blizzard half on purpose because she couldn't remember why the cold should matter, and who woke up in a stranger's arms and said thank you like she meant it, and then made me laugh within the hour. I thought, I am in serious trouble. The morning the storm broke, I knew the storm had broken before I could see it. The sound changed. The pressure in the air changed. The way a held breath changes when it's finally let go. I stepped out from under the overhang into a world that was so bright it was almost violent. 2 feet of fresh snow over everything. The pines heavy and bowed with it. The sky an impossible blue, the kind of blue that only comes after a real storm, like the sky is showing off. Eleanor came to stand beside me. She was still wearing my flannel shirt. She had both robes pulled around her shoulders like a cape. She looked at what the storm had made of the landscape, and she didn't say anything for a full minute. I've never seen anything like this, she finally said. No, I said. You wouldn't have, not from a tour. She looked at me sideways. Is that what this is? A very extreme tour? This is just the Black Hills in winter, I said, doing what they always do. She was quiet again. Then, how far to town? 4 miles, maybe 5 with the snow. 4 hours on horseback. And you'll take me? Yes, and then what? She asked. Her voice was careful again. That same careful quality as when she'd said thank you. Like she was handling something and didn't know yet if it was sturdy. I looked out at the snow, at the hills my grandfather had named for me one by one, at the sky doing its impossible blue thing. That depends, I said, on whether you're planning to go back to wherever you came from. A pause that felt about 10 years long. I hadn't planned much past the hills, she said slowly. I told you that, you did. Are you asking me to stay? I turned to look at her. She was watching me with those storm-colored eyes, serious, not performing anything, just looking at me directly the way she did everything. Straight on, no flinching. I'm asking you, I said, if you want a reason to, the ride down. We rode double on my horse, because hers had made her own way down to the lower pasture overnight, which was exactly what a sensible horse would do. Eleanor sat behind me. After about 10 minutes of trying to stay properly balanced and separate, she gave up and just put her arms around my waist and held on, and I pretended this was simply practical and not the best thing I'd felt in 4 years. She asked questions the whole way down. About the trees, I told her the Lakota names, and she repeated them until she had them. About the tracks in the snow, deer, rabbit, one long drag mark that was probably an elk. About why the snow sat different on the north-facing slopes versus the south. About everything. She was a woman who had been quiet for 2 years, I think. And the questions had been backing up. I answered all of them. The town came into view around noon. A scatter of buildings in the valley, smoke from chimneys. The whole small ordinary human miracle of a place where people live. Eleanor was quiet when she saw it. I felt her arms tighten slightly around my waist and then deliberately loosen. There it is, I said. There it is, she agreed. And then, Chayton, yes. If I were to stay, she stopped. Started again. If I were to stay for a while, would you show me the rest of the hills the way you showed me those 2 days? The real way. The names of things. I thought about my grandfather and the way he'd first brought me up here and told me the name of each rock. How he'd said, a place you know by name is a place you can never be truly lost in. Yes, I said, I would like that. She exhaled against the back of my coat, something that might have been relief. Might have been something beginning. Lane, what happened after she stayed 3 weeks. Then she went back east to settle what needed settling. A rented house, a neighbor with a key, a sister who needed explaining to. She came back in February when the second big snow was still on the ground, and the hills were white and blue and silent in the way that only very old places know how to be silent. I met her at the edge of town. She was driving herself. She'd learned between October and February to drive in winter, which seemed to me exactly the kind of thing she would do. She stepped out of the truck, and the cold air came with her, and she looked at me across the hood of the vehicle and said, "I thought about what you said, about carrying grief differently, in your back instead of your hands." And I said, "I think I'm starting to," she said. "I think being here helps." "Just the hills," I said. She smiled at that. Her whole face changed when she smiled. It wasn't a cautious thing, her smile. It was generous and a little crooked, and it went all the way up. "Not just the hills," she said. I walked around the truck and put my arms around her, and she let me. She leaned into it. Really leaned. The way she'd leaned against me in the shelter that first night. The full weight of her trusting that I wasn't going anywhere. Her forehead against my collarbone. My chin on the top of her head. The cold all around us and neither of us minding it. I thought about the night I'd found her half buried in a drift, reaching for something she hadn't caught. I thought about the way she'd said I didn't care very much. And the way she'd said I think I do now, with the surprise still in it. The genuine surprise of a person who had been dormant coming suddenly and unexpectedly back to life. I thought about my grandfather telling me that a blizzard is not a catastrophe. It is a concentrating. It strips away everything that can be stripped, and what remains is exactly and only what is real. What remained, standing in the cold outside a small town in the Black Hills, with Eleanor Marsh's forehead against my chest, was this. Her steady breath, my steady arms, and the hills around us holding their ancient, unshakable patience. It was enough. I was realizing everything. That spring she planted a garden on the south side of the house I'd built on the lower ridge. I told her which plants the deer would take and which they'd leave alone. She ignored most of what I said and planted what she wanted anyway. And the deer took some of it, and she replanted without a word of complaint. And I watched her on her knees in the dark earth with the hills behind her, and the sky doing that evening thing it does out here, turning every shade of copper and rose and old gold. And I thought, there is the woman who walked into a blizzard because she'd forgotten what she was living for. And here, finally, she had found it again. And so, quietly, without either of us making any announcement about it, had I.